While perusing programming-related media, I often encounter the expression blazingly fast. Having dabbled in the dark arts of higher category theory, I'm quite familiar with the concept of neologism, but I can't help but wonder, is this a pseudo-technical term, like embarrassingly parallel? Is it just a marketing buzzword for farming attention and engagement? Is that why I put it in the video title? Maybe blazingly fast is more of a feeling. Like love, maybe it can't be defined, but you know it when you find it. Unless you're a web dev. Hey, it's okay. I've never felt it either. Blazingly fast speeds, that is. I've made a few videos related to performance, all looking at computing large Fibonacci numbers within a second. Okay, yeah, I know. Turns out the Fibonacci sequence never terminates. I came here to do math and write monads. I don't know how it turned out like this. Would I call any of the code I've written blazingly fast? Well, the 4 millionth Fibonacci number is pretty big, but if you've watched my previous videos, there was a point where I mentioned that Python was able to hit the 9 millionth at the same time frame. Python. I know, I couldn't believe it either. So I made it false by switching to lower-end hardware. Now Python can only compute the 6 millionth Fibonacci number. Yeah, I downgraded my hardware. I've repurposed my brother's old PC into an Ubuntu server so that I can keep my programming-related hobbies separate from my main computer, which is reserved for the important stuff like doing taxes, checking emails, and losing ranks. Of course, this also reduces how far my fast squaring algorithm goes. I reported it could compute past the 4 millionth Fibonacci number on my main machine, but now it's only good for the 3.4 millionth. If this upset you, join the club. Or just build the project on your own machine so you can just blame yourself instead of me for having low-end hardware. Evidently, we still haven't outperformed Python, but this isn't surprising. This should be expected, not only because of Life Lesson 0, but also because I was being deliberately lazy and was only using grade school integer multiplication. When integers get big enough, Python uses the Karatsuba multiplication algorithm, which is asymptotically faster. Although I seem to enjoy making many videos on the same topic, I don't enjoy repeating myself. If you're curious how Karatsuba's multiplication algorithm works and enjoy hearing the name pronounced as though he were Japanese, just check out my first video. If you don't care about this algorithm, then that makes two of us. I've embarrassed myself enough the first time I put it together. Besides, we're trying to find the true meaning of blazingly fast, so let's fast Fourier word. But gee, some of you might be thinking. Why bother? The Fibonacci sequence has a closed formula, so you can compute any Fibonacci number in O of 1 time. While closed formulae are great for mathematics, they don't automatically translate to constant time algorithms. Since the golden ratio is a non-trivial real number, computing its nth power still requires some kind of fast exponentiation algorithm. Also, not to be that guy, but if you watched the first video, you'd know that the gold medalist is derived from Binet's formula. If FFTs scare you, they shouldn't. They're actually fairly simple. That's not to say that simple things can't scare you, though. If I faithfully represented something truly frightening, its scariness would be ranked very high, at least 196,883 in fact. You might think this is a big integer, but really, it's a high-degree decimal polynomial. This perspective might seem convoluted, but the really convoluted part is actually the multiplication. The Fourier transform amounts to evaluating our polynomials at specially chosen points. The point, for us at least, is that after taking the Fourier transform of each factor, we get the Fourier transform of the product essentially for free. Then, computing the original product amounts to applying an inverse Fourier transform. The points we evaluate our polynomials at are specifically chosen to be roots of unity, because that is the way of the bionicle. Well, this choice also allows us to do essentially the same thing with conjugate roots of unity to recover the polynomial coefficients. This is the inverse Fourier transform. Specifically, this is possible because cyclic sums of consecutive powers of a root of unity always vanish. You might think that roots of unity are complex, and they definitely can be. I made them complex the last time I implemented the fast Fourier transform, but the limited precision of my chosen representation of complex numbers forced me to use 8-bit digits, and even still, this limited me to at most the 6 millionth Fibonacci number before risking loss of precision errors. Surely I can do better than 6 million, right? So double precision complex numbers aren't going to cut it. I could try to roll out some arbitrary precision floats, but I have a better idea. While roots of unity can be complex, they don't have to be. The nth roots of unity are the solutions to the equation x to the n minus 1 equals 0, but nobody says that x needs to be found on the complex line. For example, 35 is a cube root of unity, modulo 97. Instead of embedding our integer digits into the complex line, we'll instead project the digits onto a ring of integers modulo some prime. Working modulo a prime p guarantees the existence of a primitive p minus 1th root of unity. For example, 5 is a primitive 96th root of unity, modulo 97, which is what I used to find 35 as the corresponding cube root of unity. For concreteness, I'll use the prime 15 quintillion 564 quadrillion 440 trillion 312 billion 192 million 434,177. Primitive 15 quintillion 564 quadrillion 440 trillion 312 billion 192 million 434,176th roots of unity aren't that hard to come by. One such root of unity is 5. Simple enough, but we're more interested in 5 to the 27th power, because this is a primitive 2 to the 59th root of unity. Keep in mind that we need the order of the root of unity to match the length of the sequence of digits of the result of our multiplication. We insist on keeping the order a power of 2 because, as I've explained before, the best way to multiply is to divide and conquer. Specifically, by dividing a sequence into its even and odd terms and recursively computing half of their Fourier coefficients, it's relatively inexpensive to combine them to build the Fourier transform of the original sequence. This essentially covers the fast Fourier transform. The inverse Fourier transform is almost the same, except that we also need to be able to divide by a power of 2. This is no problem. Since our prime is odd, division by 2 is completely lossless. Through Euclid's algorithm, we find that dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by 7 quintillion 782 quadrillion 220 trillion 156 billion 96 million 217,089. Can you believe these numbers are only taking me one take each? With the fast Fourier transform sorted out, at least in theory, we can apply it to our fast squaring algorithm. As a quick recap, the crux of this fast squaring algorithm is that we can double our place in the Fibonacci sequence through the following transformation. The whole point of taking a Fourier transform is that the convoluted integer multiplication translates to element-by-element multiplication in the frequency domain. However, since the Fourier transform and its inverse are linear transformations, we can actually do the entire fast squaring step in the frequency domain before applying the inverse Fourier transform. But gee, I hear you saying, if you fix the prime p, then isn't there still an upper bound to how far your algorithm is correct? Yeah, I'm limited to make sure that these computations in frequency space don't overflow p when mapped back into the time domain. If I use 16-bit digits, then I'll be fine so long as I'm within the ballpark of the 6 billionth Fibonacci number, which is plenty generous for our 1-second time limit. Although implementing theory in practice is always seamless in theory, kilometerage may vary in practice, so I should probably add a few words about actual implementation details. First, as you might have noticed, our choice of prime is a 64-bit unsigned integer. Although the digits themselves are 16 bits, their corresponding Fourier coefficients may require 64 bits, which means that we need to perform 128-bit multiplications to ensure we don't encounter unwanted overflow before taking the results modulo p. If you're thinking, ouch, you're right. As you might know, division is pretty expensive, and 128-bit division is even worse. However, just as the best way to multiply is to divide and conquer, the best way to divide is to multiply and shift. To see what I mean, let's look at division 101. If I asked you to write assembly for taking an integer modulo 101, maybe you would write something like this. Note that the div instruction computes the quotient in RAX and the remainder in RDX for 64-bit inputs. However, if you ask your compiler to do it, you'll get this, which translates roughly to the following C code. This magical optimization is possible because the denominator is known at compile time. However, this story is not the same when we move to 128 bits. Instead, the compiler just resorts to calling the function umodti3, regardless of optimization level. This is the fallback mod function used when hardware support for modulus isn't available on the target platform. It's fine though. We can just do it ourselves. The magic constant in this assembly is not actually too difficult to find. The way to switch division into multiplication is to multiply by the reciprocal, but the insight is to scale the reciprocal up by a high power of 2. The best choice for the exponent for this power of 2 is essentially the sum of the maximum bit length of any numerator and the bit length of the prime number itself. If we apply this trick to the number 101 for 64-bit integers, our magical multiplication factor is... But gee, I know you're saying. That's not the same magical constant. Yeah, it's a bit off. No, really, it's just a bit off. The thing is, this lemma always gives us a 65-bit factor mu. If you write out our magical constant in hex and compare it with theirs, you'll see that we are quite literally just 1 bit off, and the compiler-emitted assembly is just some simple acrobatics to ensure all results fit within 64 bits without overflow. The conversion of division into a sequence of multiplications and shivs might seem like a fairly inconsequential optimization, but given how often we perform modular arithmetic in our fast Fourier transform, this leads to very notable improvements. To demonstrate this, if we don't apply this trick and just use umodti3, it takes 1.5 seconds to compute the 4 millionth Fibonacci number. This is even slower than our fast squaring algorithm. However, if we apply this optimization, the computation speeds up to... Yeah, now we're talking. But gee, you might be wondering, why not just work modulo 2 to the 64 instead of modulo a prime? Now, before the snarky among you retort that this is just because 2 to the 64 isn't prime, this is actually an interesting question. When working modulo a prime p, I mentioned that we're guaranteed to have a primitive p minus 1th root of unity. This falls out of the fact that the group of units, that is, the multiplicative group of invertible elements modulo p, is a cyclic group. This is just algebra jargon for saying that all invertible elements modulo p are of the form g to the power of n for some integer g called a generator. Since the cyclic group has p minus 1 elements, any such generator g is automatically a primitive p minus 1th root of unity. It's okay if that didn't make any sense. All that really matters is what changes when we switch p with the power of 2. One thing that changes is that the group of units is no longer cyclic. Rather than having just a single generator, it's generated by 2 distinct elements, minus 1 and some other generator g of order 2 to the exponent minus 2. This may not seem like much of a problem. The big cyclic part still gives us a primitive 2 to the exponent minus 2th root of unity, which is plenty big for our purposes. For example, modulo 2 to the 64, one such primitive 2 to the 62nd root of unity is given by
11.
However, although 11 is certainly a 2 to the 62nd root of unity, this is not actually useful for the Fourier transform. The critical problem is that the sum of all the powers of 11 do not add up to 0. If you're wondering why this is, the problem is essentially that there are too many square roots of 1. Everyone remembers that 1 is a square root of 1, and many forget that minus 1 is technically also a square root of 1. But modulo 2 to the 64, there are actually 2 more square roots of 1. Specifically, we have plus or minus 11 to the power of 2 to the 61. If this weren't the case, the first factor up here would already be 0, and that would give us a 0 total for the sum of powers of 11. Of course, there's nothing uniquely special about 2 to the 64. While we're on the topic of not choosing a prime modulus though, there is some hope. You could instead work modulo 2 to the n plus 1, in which case you have an obvious primitive n plus 1st root of unity. The catch in this case, though, is that the modulus is exponentially larger than the order of the root of unity. This means that there's no hope that we can fit these residues modulo 2 to the n plus 1 in our tiny 64-bit registers. Therefore, if we go down this rabbit hole, you're just reducing large integer multiplication into slightly smaller large integer multiplication, and would thus need to repeat this process recursively. This is the basis of the Schönhagestrassen multiplication algorithm, but we're not going to go into that. All that theoretical talk was fun, but I think I've dragged you along for long enough. Let's see where this fast Fourier transform takes us. Et voila, the 24 millionth Fibonacci number. Interestingly, the Fourier transform gives us even more defined plateaus than our bottom-up fast exponentiation algorithm. This is because we always have to pad our Fibonacci numbers so that their digit lengths are perfect powers of 2 in order to perform our divide and conquer FFTs. Once we pad, the amount of work is approximately the same across the board until we jump up to the next power of 2. In any case though, we have finally made Python's fine-tuned C implementation of big integers eat dust, and this isn't even my final form. We can do even better with the power of friendship. If we look at my computer specs, we see that the computer has 4 cores with hyperthreading, and so far I've only been using a single thread. What? You still salty that I'm connected remotely to another device instead of using my main machine? Well, maybe you'd be less salty if you were also connecting remotely to a network of other devices. So why not sign up for this video's sponsor, NordVPN? Just as I can SSH into my new old PC from anywhere else in my home, and it's as though I never left my desk. And being a mathematician, you know my home is huge. You can connect securely to one of NordVPN's thousands of servers, and it'll be as though you live right there. This can be a huge help in bypassing geo-locked resources regardless of your nationality. Also, don't quote me on this one, but whenever I connect to one of their Australian servers, I become a lot better at higher category theory. Given all the slop that's out there on the internet, I appreciate NordVPN's ability to detect and protect against fake shops and other scams online, so that not only can you be free to choose where you come from, you're also safe from going anywhere you don't want to be. To try NordVPN for yourself, sign up at nordvpn.com/sheafification by clicking the link in the description below, or use the coupon code SHEAFIFICATION at checkout. Through that link, you'll get exclusive deals on a 2-year plan, plus an additional 4 months free. NordVPN also comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can sign up through nordvpn.com/sheafification risk-free. Thank you so much to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now let's go back to our usual programming. Get it? Since the fast Fourier transform divides and conquers, it takes very little effort to divide and co-op instead. With a dash of threading, we break past the 48 millionth Fibonacci number. This number is 4 megabytes large and has over 10 million decimal digits. At last, have we discovered the true meaning of blazingly fast? For comparison, Python takes a whopping 27 seconds to compute the same thing. But come on, it's not fair to compare against a scripting language. Let's pick on someone our own size. You know what? I think I finally understand what blazingly fast means. If you're still here, thank you for watching. If you liked what you watched, your enjoyment was probably at my expense. Luckily, there is a way for you to negate that expense somehow. If you didn't like what you watched, it's probably because you noticed that my repo is only 56.6% C. You'll definitely find it ironic, especially since I was so not sorry for switching to C not so long ago. But please, you have to understand. After fixing the prime p, I figured it'd be more efficient to pre-compute the powers of my 2 to the 59th root of unity, instead of determining them at runtime. I could have just hard-coded them in C, but I wanted a more maintainable solution that could produce the values at build time, and I wasn't creative enough to implement it with macros. I needed some way of writing code that I knew would be run at compile time, so I had no choice but to use CPP, C plus Python. I admit it, I used Python to auto-generate a header with suitable prime, all the powers of its primitive root of unity, and the negative powers of 2. With that out of the box, you might think I might as well have just pre-computed a large Fibonacci number while I was at it. But no, The point was to write a general-purpose function that could compute an arbitrary Fibonacci number, and then measure how much I could do in 1 second. Well, okay, now you're probably thinking that I didn't even achieve that, since fixing a prime number in advance limited my algorithm's correctness to below 6 billion. Yeah, I don't have a response to that. My morals probably seem like they're as frail as a feather blowing in the wind, but no matter if that's the case, I can always count on one fan to keep that wind pointing in the right direction.